Welcome to the Convey Culture podcast, where we delve into the vibrant tapestry of generations Alpha, Z, and Millennials. We're here to amplify their voices, break down biases, and shatter stereotypes. Get ready to explore the fascinating world of culture and identity and discover the true impact it has on our lives. Join us on this captivating journey. This is the Convey Culture podcast. Hello and welcome to the Convey Culture podcast. One of the important elements of starting this podcast for me was really to uncover unique journeys and stories and identities and really how someone's experiences change the way they want to contribute to the world. And so I'm very excited today. I will always be excited to have guests. I'm very excited today to have Himalaya on as a guest. Himalaya is on a mission to increase accessibility of entrepreneurship to BIPOC and rural communities, which at the moment is such a pressing issue as we look at the economic impacts of that long term. Also, I would love to dive into more of the journey of how you got there, how you became so invested in a cause that is very near and dear to my heart as well. So Himalaya, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Same, it's going to be a good conversation. Well, first, I love to have a person introduce themselves at exactly how they would want to be introduced to a stranger. But this is a friendly stranger, a nice stranger. How would you introduce yourself?
What a great and loaded first question. Um, I think that if I were to want to be introduced to someone, I think what I would want them to know about me is that I am a woman of color. I am a first generation immigrant. I am someone who deeply cares about creating equity in entrepreneurship and fundamentally believes that entrepreneurship can be a pathway to economic development, particularly in communities that have historically, due to systemic oppression, not had the same resources to be able to live life in the same way of like go to college, get a like or go to a great grade school, then go to a good college, then go get a corporate job and be able to like be successful in that trajectory. I think that for me, a fundamental truth is that I don't believe that there is one right way to do anything and that there's one true reality. And so for me, I think, well, how I would like to be introduced is to perpetuate that narrative so that many more people can also believe that and believe that they can be successful in their own way, in their own right, and achieve economic prosperity and economic agency.
So powerful. That is a powerful opening introduction because by your very existence, by the mission you're doing, you're opening so much for others. And I love when you see that connection of you finding a passion, but that also unlocks something incredible for others. So how did you get into the world of investing in VC? And it's a complicated world too. So how did you
Yeah.
get?
Yeah, one thing that actually has been coming up for me lately is I actually talked with some people who are like, when I hear you speak, it feels like if you can do it, I can do it. And I fundamentally believe that, right? I feel like anyone can be an entrepreneur, anyone can be an investor. It actually just takes knowledge and resources. And what I actually found like through working with people is that like there's another element here, which is like the drive of like not knowing what comes ahead of you and still being able to persist, right? And that's like a really uncomfortable feeling for most people. And we're not like, you know, indoctrinated with like that is the way to go. I think that as we're growing up, it's a very prescribed way towards success, a very like right or wrong path, a very right or wrong answer. And so I think most of us are conditioned to feel like, okay, I need to know that I'm doing something right. And in this pathway of entrepreneurship or VC, there is like no right or wrong answer, and no one's going to tell you, good job. Actually, most people are going to tell you that you're doing a bad job, and you're only going to get feedback when you're doing something wrong, right? And so I think it's really a tough space to navigate. So that has been coming up for me lately. So I wanted to bring that up of like, I fundamentally believe anyone listening to this podcast can be an entrepreneur if you're not already. And it's not easy, even if there are people that create pathways, and I hope that I'm one of those people that create pathways for like access to knowledge and resources, the path is still largely ambiguous. and it's individualized, and you will have to create that path. And so one of the coming back to the question, Bianca, of like, how did I do this, is like, I didn't know that I was going to do this. I didn't know every step of the way. I didn't even have like an end goal of like, I was going to get here. Every single step opened new doors that then unlocked more doors, and I just kept going and building the road. And like now in hindsight, I can be like, here's how I did it, right? And like point to the path. But like every single step that I take, that I continue on, is unknown. And so like I want to like pull that dichotomy in, and like I'm happy to share of like, how did I get here? I started off as a social worker, and I started off as a social worker in Hunts Point, and really understanding that the reality of Hunts Point is that when people look at it from the outside in, they see that as a high risk community. And they do that because on paper, it has low literacy rate, it's low graduation rates, low socioeconomic status. And so there are not individuals that are able to access that like traditional pathway of success. So it's seen as high risk. But on the other hand, when you live and work in that community, what you find is that there's all of these like incredible hallmarks for entrepreneurship. And like there's entrepreneurship that happens legally or illegally that is like by necessity, right? It's like, but regardless of what you're doing, when you are doing entrepreneurship, it's kind of the same, right? Like you are absolutely resilient, you are market responsive, you're capital efficient, all of these things that I felt like are being, like propagated by Harvard Business Review as like the top qualities of entrepreneurs, who's most likely to be successful. And then you see a bunch of tech bros exhibiting those qualities are also there in other people. And so I think for me, it felt like a disconnect between people who were, and that wasn't known to me at that time. I was just in Hunts Point feeling like there's a disconnect here. I'm not really sure how to fully proactively serve this community. I ended up leaving social work just trying to figure out, how do I reduce recidivism? How do I like help in a more proactive way? Ended up working at some nonprofits, trying to figure that out. Worked at some for-profits, then went into consulting because that's what I was doing. And then ended up getting my MBA mostly because I went to consulting firms and I said, hey, I've been doing consulting. Can I get a job? And they said, no, because you don't have an MBA. And so I was like, all right, I'll get an MBA. And when I went to get my MBA, that's when I learned about entrepreneurship as a career. And I started reading all of these articles from Harvard Business Review. And at that time, it was like, oh, I was already experiencing entrepreneurship. We just weren't calling it entrepreneurship or small business ownership. And for me, that's when it connected. And that's when I started going down this path. There's so many other steps there, right? Between like wanting to like do it and now being here running a fund. But that was the moment for me where it clicked of like, I could utilize this business education and this privilege of being in these spaces with money and funnel it into communities that don't even know about entrepreneurship as a career.
And I want to just double tap on something you said, because I do think when you ask someone, I've seen surveys, and when they say, what is an entrepreneur to look like to you? And there's a very specific image that tends to come to people's heads due to bias. And some of the most incredible entrepreneurs I have ever met are 12-year-old boys on the street of something. Absolutely. Who are in New York and they're selling and they're flipping and they're doing music. And I'm like, that person knows their target audience, knows their product, knows how to generate, is balancing budget, knows how much time it makes it worth it. And I think our school system doesn't train entrepreneurship the way it should. It makes the face of entrepreneurship look very different than what it could be. So how do you feel? I know a lot of the work you're doing with Black Founders Fund is to do that, like change what the face of entrepreneurship looks like.
Yeah. One, I want to go back to what you were saying about like, there are street performers, and we like literally pass street performers by and we're like, okay, they're fine, but like we won't consider them, we won't hold them up as people that we can learn from. And I think like very much that is like because of this like capitalistic hierarchical system where like some people who are doing a business are prioritized and seen as innovators and leaders and like people that we want to learn from, people we want to draw case studies from. But there are so many more people in the United States right now today that we could learn from, that we could like look to as a role model if we stopped looking at just hierarchical markers to be able to to determine who is successful. And so like very much fundamentally, I think you and I like will resonate on that. And I hope that other people like who are listening to this podcast do as well, because I think at the core, that is what we're trying to change, is that we are trying to make it so that anyone can be an entrepreneur, but also that as a society, we start to see that like we start to have a mindset shift around what does success actually look like? And success when it comes to customer centricity and market responsiveness, as you talked about, and revenue generation is oftentimes not prioritized because it's all about like network and net worth and your ability to access these like elite circles. And so that's what we're trying to separate, is like entrepreneurship at its core isn't about any of those things. It's about your ability to know your customer, to generate revenue, to pivot when necessary, and to be able to like be very responsive and to like understand a broader market system. And that is like fundamentally what many people have already.
And I also, to your point, those street performers are no different than what we call influencers. So the
Yeah.
idea that we've packaged it differently and called it something, I'm like, oh, these young kids have been influencers in culture and have culture stolen from them and marketed. I mean, Virgil Abloh talked a lot about how, pulling cultural influences. Pharrell talks about how he pulls cultural influences from street performers and from those experiences and going places. So it always like is unsettling to my soul that the labels can be so vastly different for different types of entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And then the prioritization is different, the monetization is different, the ability to be seen as a leader is different. And for me, that feels like at its core inequitable.
And you also work with rural communities. I live in a small town in Oklahoma, and this was my first time. Military husband sits over here. And so this was my first time, even growing up in Oregon, you see rural communities, but being out here, you see the impact of rural entrepreneurship. So from that perspective, why is rural entrepreneurship so important?
I think that actually growing up in mostly city spaces, I had my own biases when it came to rural communities. And it actually took me moving to Oregon to be able to see the similarities between people who are living in generational poverty in inner cities, Black and Brown youth, and rural communities. Both systems and both areas are actually not receiving resources from like the external community. Both are actually having to by necessity be self-reliant, but actually because of that, I think at times we like look down on both of those communities, right? Because we're like, oh, they're not as good as us, they're not getting as many resources as us. But when you live and work in both of those communities, I think what you start to see is the people of those communities, whether it's in rural communities or it's in inner cities, have a level of like knowledge and resourcefulness and like self-reliance that is incredible, and that fundamentally is what you need as an entrepreneur. Because unlike what we talked about in the beginning, if you go on this prescribed path of like, I'm going to get into, I have the privilege of going to a great grade school because we know that's socioeconomically and racially linked. And now I have the opportunity to go to a great Ivy League school. And now I go to corporate America. Every step of the way is already pretty delineated, right? And like it's transparent. You know what the next good move is. And people are telling you every step of the way, this is right, this is wrong. So it's like very much you get that like feedback all the time. But if you're trying to do entrepreneurship and the path is ambiguous and you don't know what you're doing and you don't know if it's right and you just have to figure it out, well, then like who better to do that than literally people who all their life, whether they've lived in rural communities or in inner cities without resources and have had to figure it out for themselves, who better to be an entrepreneur? And I think that's what I'm fundamentally always coming back to, is like entrepreneurs are people who have not had access to resources and have been able to figure it out. Then that is what an entrepreneur is.
And even when you talk about rural, no one knows that community better than the ones who live in it.
Exactly.
So, we take it up to this high corporate marketing level. And the number one thing we talk about is who's the customer, who's the target audience. And to be in rooms and hear how rural consumers are described, I'm like, that's actually not accurate. Like they have Pelotons in their yards. Like some of them have Pelotons in their garage. Some of them, because their disposable income is different. Some of them are heavy D2C shoppers. It's always these interesting misconceptions, and community is important to them. the hospital is a hub of entrepreneurial beacon. It's just really interesting to see how people have misnomers about rural communities and the impact they can have too.
For sure. And I will say, I'll be the first one to admit, growing up in mostly city or city adjacent spaces, I definitely grew up with bias. And it was so good for me to grow and learn about my own misconceptions and biases. And like then going out to the Midwest, like again, I was filled with all of these judgments and biases that were absolutely incorrect. And I needed to learn and grow from that and to be able to see the value in so many people that live there.
And then to that point, and I'll use an example. My stepmom works for Mozilla, and Mozilla is really invested right now in the continent of Africa. She specifically focuses on Kenya, but and all over. But part of the mission in Kenya is to get Kenyans to invest back in their own communities. And I think they're even in BIPOC scenarios, there's a lot of times where we don't know how to invest back in our communities in an entrepreneurial way or as an angel investor. So what are some ways that you think that the BIPOC community can also invest in itself or find ways to unlock investing?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I feel like it can happen in a number of ways. There are people who really do want to go down this entrepreneurial pathway, and it is not for everyone. And I think that's what I'm starting to like also caveat it. Anyone can be an entrepreneur, but the path is not for everyone because it comes with its own hardships and burdens that not everyone is positioned to be able to bear. And so, one, if you are going down that pathway of entrepreneurship, it's really important to be able to like build in two different ways. One is you can build a venture backable business that then exits and is able to provide more like of a reality to your community of like entrepreneurship as a career is a viable career path. It can also bring obviously a lot more like financial liquidity to both your family, your community, and the surrounding community. The other business though that I feel like is like highly deprioritized, even in entrepreneurship, is this idea of building a community centric business that may or may not be venture backable, that may or may not, you may not see it on the news as like this exited or was bought for like several $1,000,000, but there is something to be said about building community centric entrepreneurship that enables more of the community to be employed, that affects more of the community. No one knows your community better than you. And so if you are thinking about starting a business and it is meant for the people of your community, then employing lots of people within the community and making it a community centric business can actually have huge lasting impacts and sustainable impacts on the community. For those that don't want to be an entrepreneur, have not had that bug, have had the privilege of going down that corporate route, of being able to amass some wealth, then there are ways for you to be able to give back to the community in both of those ways. Become an angel investor, become an LP in a fund that invests in Black and Brown communities so that you can invest in Black and Brown led companies that are venture backable, that are scalable, that are going to be acquired. The other part though is absolutely also investing both your time and money into community centric businesses, because that also is a different type of investment that will also pay dividends.
That to me, and I think, of course, I have a preference to really maintaining culture, right? I feel like sometimes when you don't have community based entrepreneurship, you start to lose culture. Like you'll travel somewhere and you'll realize that this has lost its community based entrepreneurship. The restaurants are, you see them everywhere. And so it's almost like an erasure of culture. And so I'm so passionate about local food and local community and local healthcare and things that preserve culture so you don't lose that kind of connection. And so I loved that you kind of touched on that, because how do I invest in preserving culture?
Yeah,
No.
I think that's really critical to be able to do that. And I think so much of the time entrepreneurs and funders are lured by venture capital itself, right? And venture capital can, I really try to invest in businesses that are preserving that culture, as you said, and utilizing technology or products to create connections between people so that there is the preservation of culture. But that's not all venture capital is, right? And so like there are other businesses that are not going to preserve culture. And so there are there's so many businesses that are community centric that also need investment dollars and time and resources and can have like incredibly sustainable and lasting impacts on community.
Oh, I like that. I was going to pause, like, yes to that. One thing that in my space of mentoring entrepreneurs, I often felt like there was this space where there was a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about BIPOC founders, that their businesses couldn't scale or that they wouldn't know how to reach a broader audience. What are some common stereotypes you find when you're trying to get funding for your entrepreneurs?
Yeah, absolutely. One, I think that those biases also come from a misunderstanding and a lack of representation. And so when you evaluate something from a lens that is not your own, then oftentimes there's like a misplaced judgment where you use your own frame of reference and your own reality. And no matter how right that is for you and your community, that may not be right for another community or even someone in your community that is not you. Right. And so I think that oftentimes what we do, and I'll like liken this to an example where what I find is that like in venture capital, B2B SaaS is like the model of like what to back. And so then oftentimes what I'll see is like even when there are funds set up for like food and beverage or product-based businesses, investors will overlay the exact same evaluation criteria they use for a B2B SaaS company onto a non B2B SaaS company. And they'll be like, oh, they're not scalable. They're too capital intensive. They're like not going to make it. They're not going to make it as a B2B SaaS company because they're not a B2B SaaS company, right? And like you need to use at the core a different evaluation criteria that is vertical specific. And I think in the last few years, with more of a decentralization in venture capital and more Black and brown leaders in like venture capital and running funds, I think what we're starting to see is there also needs to, in addition to vertical specificity, demographic specificity. Black founders are not going to start or run businesses the same way as their counterparts in other cultures, right? And that's like the same with indigenous or the same with other people of color like Latinos or Asians. Like every single culture and community it is going to need to harness their own strengths of their community and culture, and their realities are shaped a little bit differently, and so the way that they run businesses is going to be different. And I think like from a demographic investment focus, really leaning into those differences, knowing those differences, and seeing how well an entrepreneur utilizes their culture and their community to be different can actually be the key to their success if you're not so worried all the time about like how they mold into a white centric business.
Agreed. I've seen so many briefs or just descriptions of companies that are coming to fruition, and literally their target audience, from what I can tell from a mathematical, is the top 10% of our country, right? They're only marketing to the top 10%. And I do think that when you have diverse entrepreneurs in the space, they think about a whole community. They think about a much broader, you talk about, oh, well, they're going to have a niche audience. I actually think it's the opposite. I think they have a much broader context on what the everyday person is looking for in a product or service. The amount of pitch decks I've seen where they're like, our audience is men in New York who make $100,000. I'm like, that's what, why? Like, there's so much world. So I think as the country continues to become more diverse, we have to change the way we're looking at that. Who can drive value? Because you see like an Allbirds. Yeah, they got people really excited, but no one was making any money in that kind of space.
And we definitely need more representative leaders across the spectrum, because being from a certain culture, whether it's being Black or being Indigenous or being a different person of color, is not a monolith. And so we can't just have one or a few Black leaders in the venture capital space. We need all types of Black leaders in the venture capital space who come from different educational and socioeconomic backgrounds and geographic backgrounds to be able to be fully representative. Because even within the Black entrepreneurship space, we can't just say like one Black leader's experience is able to be indicative or determinant of the pathway to success. So
yeah, you are not a sole speaker of your community, which you do find that sometimes, and you're shaking your head like, no. But there should be a plethora of those
exactly.
examples. Now, one thing I always want to touch on, and we actually kind of touch on this very early in the podcast, but how do you think generational trauma or economic disparities impact? There's a fear, there's a cautiousness, and there's a historical context. Even being out here in Oklahoma, and you can go to where the Tulsa, where that Greenwood Street was burned down. So it still feels fresh in a lot of cases. So where do you think some of that plays a role even today for founders?
I think it plays a huge role because one, when you don't have the economic background to be able to, like, when you are the first of your family to like ever try something, the bar is so high. And I feel that all the time, right? Like, I can't fail because there's no option for me to fail, like, just even for me personally, financially. But then two, always, because I'm the first person that looks like me in a space, my success or failure determines if the door is going to be open for other people. And so I think, like, from an economical and psychological social perspective, the bar is so much higher. And we talk about like entrepreneurship is this iterative process. You have to fail quickly. You have to just keep like learning and growing. But like so many of us culturally and economically are not conditioned that way. Like, everything has to work because we are taking this huge risk of like not going down this traditional path of like determined success. We're doing our own thing. A lot of us don't have our family support, not just financially, but also like, you know, mentally and emotionally. We do not have our family support because they're like, what are you doing? That pathway is unknown. We can't afford to like make mistakes like that, so you can't go down that. So when you're going down that pathway, you're like isolated from your community, isolated from your family support, and you have to psychologically be okay with like continuously failing before you hit on something and succeed. So I think that like very much being an entrepreneur is like already being in a position of privilege. And so that's like what I mean by like everyone can be an entrepreneur. Fundamentally, I believe that, but not everyone is in the economic or psychological or emotional position to have the privilege of being able to continuously fail and then like figure it out eventually, you know?
Yeah,
So,
there's no like there's no cushion. And I love that you bring up immigrant. My grandparents are immigrants, and whenever I'm like, "Hey, I'm going to do this entrepreneurial thing. I've been in this," they were like, "Man, you are." They could not fathom why I would step away from a steady corporate job to do something entrepreneurial, and they took it like to offense, and that is surprising. And I have friends whose parents are Nigerian who are like, "You are getting cussed out by your family for making this
for sure.
decision,"
For sure.
but their mindset is, go somewhere and have safety and stability. And so I think generationally things have changed too. I was trying to explain to my grandmother, staying in a job is not stability anymore. It doesn't come with pensions. It doesn't, but their mindset is very much like, this worked for us.
Yeah.
Why aren't you on this plan? This country can deliver this for you. So it's the cultural and generational differences. You're right. You don't always have someone in your corner cheering for you.
No, and like to that point, like I hear all the time, like, we came here to this country to give you a better life, to give you better opportunities, and you're throwing that away to do this like unknown thing that like will likely lead to failure, you know? And like when you grow up like that, it's so hard for you to take a chance on yourself. And literally the path of entrepreneurship is that you're going to fail several times before you get it right. So every single time something doesn't go right, I still like feel it so deeply because I'm like not only feeling that failure, I'm hearing all of the people in my family and my culture have told me like, you're gonna fail, and like you're disappointing us when you fail too, right? You're throwing away this opportunity for a better life by not going on this consistent, safe, and stable path. And so it weighs differently on us, and it's
Yes.
tough.
It also impacts creativity because you don't. I've had friends who had very wealthy friends who were like, I want to try this and I want to try this, but they had so much funding to be creative.
Yeah.
And you think back on like, no, every dollar counts, every moment counts, the pressure you get, language. And I do think some of that has such an impact in this creativity of an entrepreneurial journey, that fear of failing. It is definitely a generational trauma. It's like we have to break that, but you can feel it you can feel the fear in your community.
Absolutely. And like you, especially if you're one of the first in your community to go into a space that is largely homogenous, like you don't just feel it from your culture and your background, you feel it from everyone around you, right? Like you are the person that everyone's looking to, that everyone is trying to like figure out, like, are we going to back you or are we going to tear you down? Always.
It is it is also this, it's small minded because you're ruled by fear. But I had a friend who was a pediatrician, and she was not making great money as a pediatrician, and she wanted to do a different form of healthcare consulting that would have made her more money. But the messages she was getting, and I had to like sit her down, I'm like, no, don't listen, we're going to look at the numbers. But she was going to make like 5x more being out on her own. But to her family, walking away from being a pediatrician was like, we are done with you. It was, and that pull, and now she's doing amazing and she's thriving, and they're like, oh, we love you, but they still bring it up at holidays. They're like, but if you were a doctor, and I'm like, she's still a doctor, she's still a doctor. So it's, yeah, you get it from everywhere.
You really do. I think people always want to be cheering for you when you are successful. And like sometimes in your case, like, right, with my example with the friend, not even then, right? But like, most people I feel like are always willing, like now that I run a fund, so many people are like, oh my gosh, you're great. But that entire journey that like I got there, there was not a lot of supporters. And even now there are not so many, right? Because I think that it's difficult for people to prioritize the journey. And I'm so thankful for this, like the small number of people who have been in my corner have meant so much to me, because it has been really, really difficult. And there have been so many continuous moments of failure. And it's hard for me to not be like, oh my gosh, like this is a moment of failure. And someone told me already that it was going to fail. And like, why am I still doing this? Why am I still rolling a boulder uphill? And it feels like no one wants me to even roll this boulder uphill. It's hard, but one of the ways you asked earlier of like, how can we help our community? I think some part of that is like easing other people's journey, right? Is like, even when you see someone who's not successful, can you still believe in them? Can you still give them hope that like it will be okay, even if it's not okay right now, and you can figure it out?
No, and I would say, how can I be a resource? Just say that sentence. How can I be a resource? You may not be financial. They may say, hey, just tell me when you hear of events coming up for me to do my pop-up shop, or connect me to this person. I think we forget to say, instead of like, congratulations, just say, congratulations, how can I be a resource? And just see, I feel like we want to give advice and warning signs. And I'm like, or just help. Or just help. Okay, well, to the economy. So we are in a weird place. The economic situation, like we have high job numbers. We are raising. To me, it's a lot of mixed signals. But what unfortunately tends to happen is it feels like the first places that get hit is areas that support Black funders, BIPOC founders. It really feels like that's the first place to get hit. And then we've also seen this attack with DE&I, where they're like, there shouldn't be DE&I people on the boards of VCs and da da da. And so, how are you seeing a shift in the space at this moment? What would be your advice to entrepreneurs who are trying to enter into the space?
I think that a lot of us already knew this, right? In 2020, that when the racial justice movement was at its peak from a national visibility, that lots of people were pouring into this space with resources and money and saying, like, we care, but like also you can't care if you don't know, right? If you don't feel it every day. And so I think like a lot of us felt like, okay, it's great that it's here now, but it won't last forever. And like we're starting to see that now, right? I think that fundamentally, if you're doing this to assuage your own guilt, then it will not last, right? Because when you do something to assuage your guilt and the market is volatile and you need to protect your own, you will protect your own, and the assuaging guilt will come last. But if you fundamentally are hearing what we're saying, which is that people without external resources are extremely resourceful and resilient. And those are the literal hallmarks of what makes a good entrepreneur. And you're not doing this because you're trying to assuage guilt. You're doing this because you fundamentally believe that street performers are excellent entrepreneurs. Then now is the right time. When the market is volatile, that is when the best entrepreneurs emerge, because there's not so much capital floating around. And so the most resilient, the most persevering, the most capital efficient, the most customer centric entrepreneurs will be the ones that succeed. That's who you're going to find in Black entrepreneurs.
Love that. And I agree. It's what are they, cream rises to the top, like you find a way, you'll find a way during this time period. So I'm glad to hear that the charge is still a good space to be an entrepreneur. There's still a lot of opportunity. The other question, I guess, and this goes more to what gives you joy about the work you're doing? Like what feels like success at the end of the day?
That is a really, really tough question. Actually, probably more tough than any other questions. I
Yeah.
think fundamentally, because of what we talked about with like the cultural piece, I never feel like anything's good enough. I never feel like I'm doing enough. I never feel like we are like succeeding in enough ways, because the goal of changing societal mentality around who can be a successful entrepreneur and seeing Black entrepreneurs as like people that we can learn from, people that should be propped up as thought leaders, is like such a big charge that sometimes it feels really hard to feel like we're making meaningful progress. But I will say, I think what brings me the most joy on a day to day basis is being able to have people that work within the team and that work with me. I think seeing people in positions of leadership at the BFM fund and in many of the nonprofits that we've spun up, that brings me joy, because it feels like you are actually a representation of who we're trying to support, and to be able to see people outside of me and outside of that, like just like watching them shine, really gives me a renewed sense of purpose, because I'm like, if it can happen for this one person, our mission is still there and it can happen for more people. So I think being able to see BIPOC entrepreneurs, BIPOC leaders emerge and like go through the BFM fund or go through Emerge or go through venture partners and really see them shine, and really like, I think there's a moment where people start to like go through a lot of turbulence and turmoil, and then they start to like really really realize that like they've had it all along, and they like that it's not easy, but that they can do this. Seeing that moment is like the most rewarding moment I feel like I can ever have, is like when someone really really believes in themselves enough to like keep pushing and keep driving and keep going on their dreams.
I love that. That feels right. Like it does. That would give me so much joy to know you pushed a button in an elevator and you help them, and then suddenly they're at this floor and they're successful in it.
Yeah, yeah, to know they
That,
can do it.
you know, you can do it. All right. Okay, now some questions. I have one. Now, you hear mixed messages about this, and with the rise of social media, is it important for a founder to have a heavy digital presence? Should they be online? Should they be on social? Because people casually be like, oh, you should be on social media. And that is a whole full time other job on top of everything else. So, what is your recommendation on how much founders should pour into that? Do VCs care?
I think that do VCs care is a nuanced question, because I think that just like anything else, VCs are not a monolith, and every single fund and every single VC investor is going to care about different things. And genuinely, I say this with like grace and empathy. I think a lot of founders put a lot too much attention on investors and funders instead of putting more attention on their customers. And I know, like, especially when you're building, you're like, I need money to make this work. And so it's like natural to put a lot of emphasis on funders. But I will say, to your question around how important is social media, it depends on if it's important to your customers. It depends on if it's important to be able to like reach your customers. It depends on if you're doing a B2B versus a B2C company. If you're doing a B2B company, then like it may or may not matter if you're on social media, because your customers aren't, that's not how they're getting like the most messaging around like your credibility and access to like connections to conversion for customer acquisition. Like that's not how they're doing it. They're doing it through other channels. And so
Right.
like that's what you need to focus on. If you're doing a B2C, like a business to consumer, right, a direct to consumer type business, and the consumers are your audience, it still may or may not be the right vehicle. Are your specific customers gathering information and understanding what like brand strength is and what features are most important to them and who's out there in the market through social media? If so, then yes. But if not, then like there are other channels. And I think I keep going back to that is like customer centricity is the base of a really strong business model. And so like, and that your customers needs and wants are going to evolve. And so you can't just be like, I know what my customers want. Like every day it's going to like change a little bit.
Very
But going back to your customers and figuring out how do they receive information? How do they make purchase decisions? How do they interpret brand strength? And that will give you the answer.
I think that's powerful from a marketing perspective too, because it's the same rule, but I do think you get bogged down when you should be on this platform, you have to have a presence here, and now everyone talks about personal brand so much that it has become this whole separate effort, even apart from your business and building it. It's interesting. Okay, now we're doing rapid fire questions.
Okay.
These are fun. These are, casual, whatever comes to mind. Okay, if you could work with or invest in any brand, you have a blank check, you're writing it, who would it be? Who are you really excited about?
Okay. So these are two separate things. So one is like if there's like a celebrity that I feel like has a personal brand that I like really, really care about, or like a vertical that I'm like super excited about. Which one would you like me to answer?
A vertical. I like a vertical.
A vertical. Okay. If I had a blank check right now, I would write investments into Femtech. I think that Femtech is super critical and important. And so many more entrepreneurs are realizing that, like, every single thing, it's not just medical devices or access to testing, which is critically important, but like the leggings that we're wearing, the shoes that we're wearing, the healthcare that we receive is not centric to both the like female identity, but then also from a cultural perspective is like not being culturally competent and addressing all of the unique needs. And so I would say that is an area that we have not seen it grow or it to its fullest potential at all. We are very much in the beginning of what Femtech can look like. And so that's where I would put my dollars.
Which is insanity when like over 50% of the planet is. I always am fascinated by the efforts that I just saw the Barbie movie, but it makes me laugh because the amount of effort that is put into a male gaze on healthcare or technology or that piece. So I love that. Okay. The next one, what are the least likely 3 words someone would use to describe you?
These questions are
I know. That's why they're never rapid fire, because everyone's like, what? Least 3? What? It's like another introduction.
Okay. Least 3 words. What is the opposite of chaos? That would be like the least one of the least 3 words. Maybe like has it together? Like I don't have it together ever. I'm like constantly just like figuring things out. That would be one of those things. And honestly, like I saw that as a huge negative growing up because I always felt like I'm so chaotic. Like I'm not like organized or like focused in any way, but also like as an entrepreneur I realized like that is actually the key to my success. I'm not like wedded to one path and I'm like this is the path, it's do or like this is it. I'm wedded to the mission and I'm gonna get there and I'm gonna be successful, but the way we get there is fluid and ever changing. And so I would say like maybe the right word is structured. I am definitely not structured.
Not structured. But you have a focus, so
I have a focus. I definitely do. And it is like, it's like my entire life and my passion and everything. But the way you get there is like very fluid. So structured would not be a way to describe me. Man, Bianca, these are
work. Like if someone saw me at home, they would never describe me as. I know it's hard, right? Like
this is really hard.
It's so funny because everyone can say 3 words to describe themselves. Yes. Likely, everyone's like, I don't know. It's a funny one.
People would not say that I can cook.
Okay. everything. You gotta pick them.
I can't. There's a 50-50% chance, like 50% it will be soggy and like unbearable to eat, and the other 50% will be that it'll poison you. So
No,
that
okay.
none
So
of those
that
are
don't
good.
need person to stay out of the kitchen. Shy? I
Um,
would say you're not shy. Like, I don't think, would that be a word they would use
yeah,
that?
I don't think people would say that. I think, oh my gosh, Bianca, you really like this is
Like,
like an
now
introspective moment.
you look at introspective, you're like, what would I
I
never be
know.
described as?
I think people would not describe me as elitist. I
Oh,
like very much am constantly questioning everything and questioning our systems of power and like how they like continuously oppress one another, how capitalism continues to oppress, how hierarchy continues to oppress. So I would say like elitism is one of my
so no one would ever describe you as silent, elitist, or structured.
yeah.
I think those are good
I
things.
think those are good. Yeah. The cook thing was just like I was like really that is like a fact that you probably should know about me. My if you do come to my house, Bianca, my wife is a brilliant chef, and so rest assured I have not touched any of the food
You
that
never,
is going to
you always
be
need one in the house. Everyone talks about equity in a relationship. I'm like, it's you. Everyone's like, oh, 80-20. I'm like, no, you got to be good at different things. So you just are in your environment. Something's always taken care of. So, I
Yes.
think
I
it's a
will
good.
clean though. I have Virgo energy, so like the cleaning is gonna be like too much, so it's gonna be great.
That's a good balance, the cook and the clean, because that's how my husband is. He will clean and I will cook. And I'm perfectly happy with that gender stereotype. I'm like, you clean as much as you want because no, I don't like it. I'm like, find something else. All right. You have $300 to spend. It needs to be something selfish. So don't say something amazing about someone else. It has to be a very selfish, ridiculous purchase with $300. What do you buy? The
Why
more
are these
someone's in a
questions so hard?
because the more someone's in a social impact role, the harder it is for them to answer these questions. If I have someone in marketing, they're like, blah, 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 because they all the time they're fed things they want. But if you're in social impact, they're the hardest guests to answer these questions. You have a different lens on yourself.
Um, yeah, this is really, really difficult because the first thing that came to my mind was something for my dogs.
Oh,
uh,
I guess you could buy
I
something, but something for you. Like you'd walk by a store or a dinner.
these are really, really challenging. Okay, um, what would I love beyond like social change? Can I buy social change for $300?
With
Definitely
$300,
not.
you can invest in social change. And do a dress from anthropology. I don't know. It's like, what would come to you first? $300. The
Okay.
true
You know
unselfish.
what you know what I would this is like this is really like causing a lot of introspection in this moment here. I think what I would get is okay, I don't know if this is fully like non-selfish, but I really really love community gardens. And so, and a lot of times you have to pay for community gardens. And so, what I would do is I would get the biggest plot I could get and grow only food on there that was then accessible.
It's beautiful. It's still very non-selfish, but
I couldn't think of anything. I
you
couldn't do it.
you remained in your soul. So now our new word that would never describe you is selfish. Now we have a new one. It was too much. Too much.
You know what? You know what? I will say this. Okay, here's something that I do really love is I love going to Korean spas. And so that is really selfish because that is just about me and I really love it and I could go to Korean spas every day and like just be in the hot rooms and then go to the cold rooms. So
Oh,
okay, so there we go.
there you
Like
go. So $300 now, Korean
yeah.
spas.
Yeah.
Right. Very last question. Would your 12-year-old self think you're cool?
I think my 12-year-old self would not think that I'm cool because my 12-year-old self was like all about like burning every system to the ground and like, total anarchy. So I think my 12-year-old self would be like questioning constantly like what I'm doing. So I would say my 12-year-old self is probably cooler than I am now.
Your 12-year-old self didn't just have context of the world and that you can't burn it all down. That's all it is. Yeah. I would debate that yes, they would think you were cool. And also
You know, I even as a 12-year-old, as to your point, Bianca, like
Yeah.
I was never silent and I would like always thought about like total world revolution. So, it's pretty cool.
Yes, to have the, I always feel like 12 is the perfect age to ask because there's something about when you are 12, it is, you're not quite in high school where they've changed your mind a little bit and
Yeah.
you're so worried
Yeah.
about the outside gaze. You're a little still, your fearlessness at 12 is a little higher
Yeah,
than
for sure.
14.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest. I could talk to you forever, but I realize this eventually has to come to an end. What's the best way to people for connect with you, get involved, to support all the good stuff?
So one of the biggest and best ways you can get in touch and support is one, we have our website, right? It's bfm.fund. And that gives you an overview of all of the things that we do, both philanthropic as well as with the fund, and the many ways that you can get involved as an investor, as a mentor, as a startup founder. And so there are lots of ways to be able to support the mission. And then, of course, my LinkedIn as well. That is actually the only social media I have. I lost my password in like 2013 to Instagram, and that was that. So,
You've never gone back. You haven't missed much since 2013. You really haven't. Well, I will also advocate that you were an amazing guest and an excellent speaker. So if anyone out there is looking for speakers, definitely
thank you.
consider Himalaya. She's incredible.
Thank
And
you.
thank you. This has been a very special episode. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. This has been so great, not just on a professional front, but also has made me question a lot of things personally. And so I'm going to go
You're
reflect
welcome.
on that.
It does that. You're like, I don't know who I am. Who am I not? Thank you.